Israel diaspora relations, Antisemitism, and Anti-Zionism, the interplay of American and Jewish values, transformation in the American Jewish family, the impact of Jewish education, gender and sexuality in American Jewish life, and portrayals of Jews and Jewishness in fiction and spin-off, and other things. That's pretty amazing. Professor Fishman was the founding co-director of the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, the HCI, and she currently edits the HCI Institute on Gender and Jewish Women. Among other honors, Professor Fishman received the Marshall Square Award from the Association for the Scientific Study of Jewry, and we are extremely fortunate to have her this morning. So please welcome Professor Sylvia.
Hi, I am really happy to be here with you. No, lights. No, like, guys, the opposite. Thank you. All right, can you all read? And I can see your faces, so don't forget that. Okay, so what we're going to do this morning is we're having a kind of two-part seminar on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in contemporary social movements. And what I'm going to prioritize is teachable materials. One of my goals is to be able to give students the intellectual tools so that they can tell the difference between a narrative which at least doesn't disagree with what we know about human history, and those which, in fact, are ahistorical. A lot of the wonderful icons and visual materials and written materials that we've been seeing yesterday are really, each one tells a story. And we sit here and we gasp because we know what the real history is. So it's shocking to us. What we forget is that many of our students who don't know the history, they don't find it shocking. And that's why those icons can be so persuasive, because if people see them and they don't understand that they actually contradict history, then the visual power of those images can persuade them that a different history is actually going on. So I think that one of the things that we all need to think about as we give our classes information on these subjects is how can we give them, without subjecting them to all getting doctorates in history, how can we give them the information that they need so that they can recognize the difference between something which is a political statement but fits into what we know about historical narratives and things which are in fact contradictions of history. Over the past few sessions, we've had several definitions of anti-Semitism, and we've even had several definitions of what Jews are. And this actually is reflected in the anti-Semitic materials which are out there in contemporary social movements. So, for example, Omar Barghouti, in one of his talks in California, said that the Jews in Israel are not a people. He says, this isn't a people, this isn't a nation. So what we see or we can even think of the way in which Jewish women have been treated in many wings of the contemporary feminist movement. I'm a feminist, I'm an old feminist. And suddenly to be told that Jews are not a distinctive group, that Jews are just a subset of white America, then that is ahistorical. And I see that it's not well known that it's ahistorical. So these are really differences in narratives. And a lot of our attention this morning in these two sessions is going to be on narratives, because narratives turn out to be very important. And we're going to start with real foundational things which I think might be useful for classes, like who are the Jews? What are the Jews? I have a list here, and I'm going to go through why I think each one of these points is important for students to start with if we want to teach them how to recognize anti-Semitism when they see it. And I would love to hear from you after we've gone through this list. What were you surprised that it's on the list, or don't think it belongs on the list? And what do you think might be added to this list? So I always like to start chronologically, because I think that a lot of people are not by nature historical. So starting chronologically helps people put furniture in their brains so history has a place to come in and sit down. So if we start with the first Jews, were actually people from Judea. Now, we know that that's what Jews were called because of external evidence, archaeological evidence, and what people wrote about the early Jews from other cultures. And that's pretty much the way I approach talking about ancient materials in my classes. I don't like to deal with, I love my people's birth narrative as much as anyone, but I don't like to deal with parts of the Jewish birth narrative which precede external corroboration. So I start basically with Davidic times, when you start to get archaeological evidence of various kinds. We see that Jews are referred to by other peoples, and what an early Jew was a person from Judea. So that's geography and ancestry. So if we're thinking we're going to make a kind of a composite of what Jews are, it starts out with Jews are people from a certain place, and then when there are several generations of them, there's ancestry, okay? So they're either people who live in Judea or people whose parents or grandparents came from Judea. Those are the early Jews. It's what we would call sociologically ascribed identity. It's identity that you are born with. You might call it ethnicity today, peoplehood. And then we start to get references from other cultures to the early Jews as people with distinctive beliefs and rituals. So one of the places that we have information about these early Jews is the early diaspora, very early diaspora of Jews in Greek-speaking Alexandria. Alexandria is founded in 323, but there are already Jewish refugees in Egypt from after the first temple. And we have information about the Jews of Alexandria, both from Philo, who was a Jew who was writing later, and also from some of the Greek materials. The Greeks didn't much like the Jewish distinctive beliefs and rituals. If you see in the next bullet point, they saw Jews as being problematic because, first of all, as one of the speakers mentioned yesterday, the Jews were lazy people. One day every single week, not only did the upper classes rest, but everybody rested, including the servants. Like, what kind of an idea was that? So the only way that the Hellenistic culture had of understanding that was that it was laziness. Jews had these bizarre dietary preferences. They didn't eat pork, which was one of the most accessible animal proteins. And then they were atheists. Jews were atheists. Why were they atheists? Because they didn't worship any of the known gods. They said they had this invisible God, but no one could see this God. So that the understanding of what Jews were was that it was problematic. They had their own languages, but not in Alexandria because they spoke Greek, but that became one of the features of the Jewish people. So they had this culture. And even though, as was mentioned yesterday, with the advent of Christianity and then later Islam, hatred of the Jews was amped up. Even before Christianity and Islam, we see this hatred and resentment of these characteristics. This is one of the things that we're going to see, is that every single one of the characteristics of what a Jew is historically, every one of those characteristics then becomes the basis for anti-Semitism. So what a Jew is, either distorted or resented for some reason, which we'll talk about, or turned inside out, which sometimes happens, becomes a reason for anti-Semitism. The next bullet point, and this is later on, people whose religious culture emphasizes family and communal institutions. This becomes especially characteristic of the Jews after the destruction of the Second Temple, when they really become mostly a diasporic people, and the rabbinic reinterpretation of Judaism stresses very, very much family and community as the basic building blocks of society in the various geographical locations that Jews lived. And at that point, when we have Jews as a diasporic people scattered throughout the world with distinctive characteristics, at that point, Jewishness really blends everything together. All of these first bullet points are blended together except for the Jews being people from Judea. So they are removed from that geographical identification, and Jewishness becomes a blending of ancestry, religion, and culture. And that is really important, that during the hundreds of years of rabbinic Judaism in various locations, both the Sephardic community and the Ashkenazi communities, blends these elements of ancestry, religion, and culture. And the reason that is very important to contemporary anti-Semitism is because one of the first things that happens with modernity is that Jews are forced to separate those strands. They're forced in different countries to separate the strands of religion and culture and ancestry, and we'll get to that in a minute. So Jews are identified as a different race or ethnicity or nation, or as we prefer now to call Jews often as different peoplehood, but they're separate from other people. They have, as I said, a different religion or culture. They have a sense of responsibility towards Jews worldwide, and this makes people often think of them as being either clannish or an international conspiracy. So that's an example of where anti-Semitism is building on a Jewish characteristic. So the Jewish characteristic of Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Lazeh, that Jews are responsible for each other worldwide, that becomes the basis of one of the foundational accusations against Jews in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's an international conspiracy. They're clannish, they stick together, they take care of, so taking care of each other becomes something which is a negative rather than a positive. And then there is a connection to the land of Israel for hundreds of years, and for most Jews, it's an emotional connection, a psychological connection, a connection which is embedded in prayer and ritual. And it's interesting, isn't it? There's a kind of bracketing. The Jews start out as the people from Judea, and then the connection with that land, which then becomes Israel. So you have a geographical bracketing. If we're talking about who is a Jew, you have a geographical bracketing, which then becomes the basis for anti-Semitism. So you have the anti-Semitism against the early Jews, these strange people from Judea, and we end up with anti-Zionism, which is, I would argue, a form of anti-Semitism also. So as I said, I would say that anti-Semitism, if we want to make it simple, is hatred, mistrust, envy, or fear of any of the characteristics of what is a Jew. And a lot of this is about narratives. If you think about it, each anti-Semitic accusation is the creation of a false narrative about Jews, which is in some ways a distortion or inversion of true narratives about Jews. As I mentioned, one early example of anti-Semitism is a pogrom in 38 of the Common Era in Alexandria, Egypt. The Jews had been living there for hundreds of years. They were embedded in groups of other people, and they were to some extent assimilated in that they spoke Greek, but many of them were actually quite careful about what they understood as their Judaic observances, and these observances excited the dislike of other people. They, as I said, were accused of rejecting pagan gods, and also, in addition to what's on this slide here, another reason that Jews were disliked was that they sent money back to support the temple in Jerusalem. This kind of reminds me of accusations today that Jews have dual loyalties, American Jews have dual loyalties because they support Israel. So we see that even though most of our time here this morning we're going to be talking about contemporary anti-Semitism, it's very interesting to the extent to which tropes of anti-Semitism are repeated over and over again. Okay, so if we're talking about modern anti-Semitism, we are talking about the current distortion of ideas of Jewishness. And to what all of the things that have been said yesterday, I'm going to add, as you see it in capital letters at the top of this list, I would add that, in my opinion, it's anti-Semitic to judge Jews or the Jewish state by standards different than other groups of people or countries are judged. Actually, the Anti-Defamation League makes this one of their standards of anti-Semitism, and I think it's really important. The basis of morality is to have even scales, and if Jews and Israel are judged by different standards than other countries are judged by, then they are always going to come up short. But what Israel gave Jews an opportunity to do was to enter into human history. Unlike George Steiner that we heard yesterday, that Jews should remove themselves and stay remote. Israel plunges Jews into the messiness of history, and history is messy. Statehood is messy. Okay, so we see that many aspects of anti-Semitism are distortions or inversions of what we talked about as definitions of Jews and Jewishness. Fear of Jews as an international network or cabal, famously publicized by the forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it's really shocking the extent to which That charge emerges, including in the American political scene today, over and over again. Next one, suspecting Jews of causing particular catastrophes. We saw this in the accusations earlier that Jews, for example, were prominent in the slave trade. And as one of the speakers mentioned yesterday, Jews didn't even live in the countries which were engaged in the slave trade because they had been exiled. They had been thrown out of those countries. So there's this kind of turning inside out. Very common still, this slur that the Jews, the Mossad and the CIA did 9/11 when America and Israel basically had a lot to lose, but this kind of turning inside out. It's not that different from the psychology of the ritual blood libel, which famously took something which was absolutely forbidden to Jews. My fantasy about the way that whole ritual blood libel thing got started is that someone observed Jews doing ritual slaughter, shechita, and saw that the blood was poured out. And it was inconceivable to the watching person that they were going to waste the blood, which is, after all, protein. And so many cultures have things like blood sausage. I mean, that's actually something which people make and eat. And so the slur against the Jews that they actually even used human blood was a turning inside out, an inversion of actual Jewish behaviors. So in the same way, the idea that the Mossad and the CIA were responsible for 9/11 is a kind of a ritual bloodline. It's a turning inside out of actual Jewish behaviors. The next bullet point, jealousy of Jewish success and unfair advantages. This is an example of a distortion of Jewish behavior also, especially since Jews have become a diasporic people. They have learned how to regroup. They've learned how to be resilient as groups of people. What do you do when you're thrown out of the country you're in? You come to a new country. You have to figure out, Jews, as I mentioned, it's a communal culture. So anytime you come into a new community, you have to get together, the Jews have to get together because they need a cemetery. They need, for hundreds of years, they needed ritual immersion places for women. So they can't do it by themselves. No Jew can do it by himself or herself. So Jews need a community. Once they're in a community, then they have to get on their feet financially. Jews learned how to do this over and over and over again. That became a Jewish communal skill, how to regroup. And that success gained Jews a tremendous amount of envy, so that you still hear slurs against Jews that come out of envy and suspicion that there must have been some way they did it that was unfair. There must have been some way they did it that was unfair, and you hear that even again from American politicians. Jews with all those Benjamins, referring to money. And the fact that Jews historically were bankers, often in European cultures, where for a while Christians weren't allowed to be bankers, also added to that. The demonization or hatred of, first of all, go back, Holocaust diminishment or denial. This we have very, very much today, and it's a form of anti-Semitism. It doesn't match their narrative about Jews. If Jews have unfair advantages, and if Jews are successful because they don't play fair in some way, how does it work to think that millions of Jews were killed? And so it doesn't match their narrative of the Jews as a lucky people, a people with unfair advantages. So we see still, and even more now, the phenomenon of Holocaust diminishment or denial being part of anti-Semitism around the world, in Muslim countries, but also in other countries as well. The negative feelings about Jews in religious groups. This has been ameliorated to a large extent within Christianity. The charge of Jews as Christ killers is no longer something which is emphasized in most places. We still get references to Jews as apes, monkeys, or pigs in certain Muslim countries. And this leads into the demonization or hatred of Israel as a Jewish state. It's very troubling to some groups of people that Jews should have their own country. It doesn't match what is supposed to have happen to Jews. Judging the Jewish state by different standards than other countries are judged. I think that that is front and center if we want to talk about manifestations of anti-Semitism. That unfair scale upon which Israel is evaluated compared to other countries is something which we need to recognize as a form of anti-Semitism. I have quotes on this next bullet point here. Other countries were formed without violence, and Israel is not a legitimate country because Israel was formed with violence. Now, anyone who knows anything about history, the history of the world, realizes that this is ridiculous. There is no country which was formed without violence at one point in the history of the country or the other. But this is a charge which is being leveled today in America by groups about Israel, that even the formation of Israel in 1948 was not legitimate. They're not talking about the territories. Even the formation of Israel in 1948 was illegitimate because there was a war. Now, if you think about world history, which country didn't have a war at some, but that's that uneven scale thing, where Jews and Israel are judged by different standards. And it's one of the reasons that one needs to always pay attention to the historical realities and to call them out. And this is something which is very much exacerbated by various kinds of media, by Twitter, that there are non-facts which are promulgated very, very vividly. You saw many of the images yesterday in the presentations which showed imagery. And people who don't have historical backgrounds believe them. And then there is the hatred of Jews because they are linked to Israel, because they provide communities for each other, and because they have different customs. And these are all ideas which are part of the dialogue today. So we see characteristics of Jews which are kind of turned inside out. Okay, the way Jews see themselves, of course, is quite different than the way anti-Semitic narratives present them. And I have here a paragraph about the way Jews have seen themselves historically, including in recent history. They were proud of the fact that they survived despite a tremendous amount of persecution and wild cards coming up in various places. The Jews who came to the United States came from countries where they were regarded as pariahs by surrounding Christian and Muslim majorities. Jews in the older generation in America, who were younger at one time, were convinced that Jews were always vulnerable and should remain vigilant to potential anti-Semitic flare-ups. And this was a phenomenon which lasted for a long time in the United States. I would say 3 generations in. They were always vigilant to the sense of possibility of anti-Semitism. Jews felt vulnerable. One of the differences in the youngest generation of American Jews now is that many of them do not feel vulnerable. They are convinced by this rhetoric that they are white and not distinctive, and somehow Jewish history has vanished in certain ways in their minds. So the image that American Jews have had in their minds about themselves is that they have a special responsibility to be supportive to people who are suffering, that their own personal suffering should make them responsible and caring for other people who are suffering. And because of that, starting all the way from the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s and 1960s, when sociologists did interviews with American Jews, and they asked them, what is the most important thing about Jewishness? What is the most important thing about your Jewish identity? Those American Jews most often said, to be a Jew, a good Jew, is to work for civil rights, and this is a direct quote, to help attain equality for Negroes. Language changes over time, but that was the operant term at that time. The American Jewish passion for the civil rights movement was extremely powerful. That was one of the ways in which American Jews identified themselves. The image of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a famous American rabbi, marching in Selma is still iconic for American Jews. And perhaps most persuasive of the passion for civil rights and liberal sentiment of American Jews is that they continue to vote, almost 3/4 of them, for liberal candidates. That's the American Jewish voting pattern. So when American Jews would read about the suffering of Jews historically, they transferred that consciousness of what it is to be an oppressed people to people who were oppressed and suffering in the United States. This sense of Jewish vulnerability lingered even after American Jews were considered to be white folks. Many Jews insisted that American Jewish whiteness was different than those of real white people, Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That was the group that novelist Philip Roth designated as the real owners of this place. So Jewish whiteness often seemed to be whiteness of a different color, to take the name of a terrific book on the subject. But as the 20th century wore on, images of the Jew in popular culture underwent transformation. Jews were no longer stereotyped as accented and struggling newcomers. Instead, Jews were often portrayed in American culture as the bourgeoisie, the new bourgeoisie, or sometimes the new wealthy people. And Jewish authors did a lot to publicize this new image of the Jew. So some authors satirized upwardly mobile Jewish men, but lots of authors publicized the wives of upwardly mobile Jewish men. Herman Wouk, Philip Roth, countless film and television screenwriters put a spotlight, and this new image of Jewishness was a spiritually bankrupt Judaism as consumerism. So the reason that I am going into this is that these images are now part of the dictionary which is used by contemporary anti-Semites and contemporary anti-Israel anti-Semites, that image of the Jew as white, crass, materialistic. It's a new Jewish stereotype, and it still contributes to hatred of the Jews. Okay. One of the things, as I mentioned, is that through all of this, despite the change in the image of Jews themselves, Jews continue to have this very liberal and pro-civil rights voting pattern. And that's really important because the usual pattern socioeconomically is that when people become financially comfortable, they often forget their experience as immigrants of being discriminated against and threatened, and their voting patterns switch. But Jewish voting patterns still remained extremely liberal. They still to this day remain extremely liberal, and concern about the disadvantaged in society remains a striking characteristic of American Jewish voting patterns. Okay, in its early years, Israel was often described as a small but plucky David struggling against the Goliath of large surrounding Arab countries who attacked Israel the day after statehood was declared, openly intending to annihilate Israel and its inhabitants. Israel's victory against what many saw as insurmountable odds seemed at the time almost miraculous. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because for a while, liberals and even radicals liked Israel. This is why. The secular labor government and agrarian kibbutzim during Israel's early years attracted the support of both Jewish and non-Jewish admirers, including various unions such as the AFL-CIO and many socialists. This changed dramatically, so it's important to realize that at first things were better. Israel's entrepreneurship in rescuing oppressed Jews, including Jews of color, from Yemen, Ethiopia, Morocco, India. Russia were not Jews of color. They were really white, but they were different and had their own struggles, which were very, very different. All of that received very positive press coverage. And at that point, Israel's image fit in well with the American Jewish self-image, even though support for Israel was far from universal by American Jews. Some American Jews were worried that that would make them appear disloyal, that they would have dual loyalty. So that concern about dual loyalty was always something that was on the mind of American Jews. But they were proud. They felt proud, and it fit in with their own liberal self-image. But then the image of Israel, a vulnerable Israel, shifted. And this is when Israel began to have trouble and American Jews began to have trouble with their own self-image. In its early years, the Jewish state was often described as David in the story of David and Goliath, a small, plucky Jewish state struggling against the Goliath of large surrounding Arab countries. Somehow, in the contemporary milieu, that image of large surrounding Arab countries and even of Arab military power and the sheer number of powerful Muslim and non-Muslim Arab states, somehow that image has been lost if we think about the way things are portrayed in contemporary news stories. Muslims are minoritized, that means they function as a minority in many countries. But there are many countries in the world where they are not a minority. And if you read stories about Muslims and Jews, somehow the Jews are portrayed as large and powerful, and the Muslims are often portrayed as minoritized, as though this large segment of the world, which consists of powerful, super wealthy Muslim countries, did not exist. Over the years, the positive image of a tiny, courageous Israel was replaced by negative images in many settings, especially in liberal leftist academic environments. Israel's armed forces appeared manifestly stronger than many had imagined when her anticipatory strike against lethal force in 1967 not only quickly defeated and pushed back the armies of large enemies massed around her, but also put into her hands the Sinai Peninsula, the Western Wall, the West Bank, and Gaza, along with nearly 1 million Palestinian inhabitants. Israel's leaders initially offered to return this all for a peace settlement, but Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and other Arab countries were rearmed by the Soviet Union, supporting a USSR Arab Middle East foothold. That's why the Soviet Union did it. And in 1967, Arab League summit members issued the Khartoum Declaration, that's Khartoum, Sudan, which came to be called the Three No's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel. And it's really important to remember because this is erased from every description of the Israel-Arab conflict now. After 1967, Israel was no longer pictured in the media as a vulnerable underdog. Descriptions of Israel seldom mentioned Israel's small size and the fury of her enemies. Television news coverage, as well as print journalism and photography, made the plight of Palestinian refugees crowded into the refugee camps with extraordinarily high birth rates and palpably miserable living conditions better known to the American public than many other international crisis situations. The PLO was formed in a Cairo summit in 1964, okay, 1964, for the purpose of creating liberated Palestine in Israel. Now, I just want to emphasize that that was 1964. Liberated Palestine in Israel meant Israel, the country that was given by the United Nations to the Jewish population. And Fatah leader Yasser Arafat assumed PLO leadership in 1969. That, of course, is after 67. And he was partially responsible for the adoption by the UN of the resolution, Zionism is Racism, in 1975. And the USSR was very, very instrumental in all of this proceeding. They had a lot to gain by undermining Israel. So there were powerful forces organized against Israel. And what we have is a kind of confluence of public relations images coming together that work to delegitimate Israel. And one of the things that was very helpful in delegitimating Israel was by portraying her somehow as a large aggressor, despite her size. So the narrative of a vulnerable Israel became very, very lost, and the opposite narrative became the primary one. Here's another claim which became very significant, which was temple denial. All right, the claim that the Jewish temple in Jerusalem had never existed. And what you can see is happening in these various elements is a kind of delegitimation of the Jewish claim to Israel, a delegitimation even, as we've mentioned, of the Jewish claim to being a minority. You have this tiny group of people, and somehow they're being portrayed as very powerful and very aggressive. The claim that the Jewish temple in Jerusalem never existed becomes another way of delegitimating the Jewish historical claim to Israel. And it also is symptomatic of another issue which becomes extremely problematic, which is the proliferation of fake news. In other words, non-facts being repeated and also being vividly pictured. You saw yesterday a number of very, very powerful images in the various presentations. One of the images was of ritual blood libel, and then later of Jews kind of drinking Palestinian blood being squeezed out of oranges. The turning inside out of historical fact is something which is ongoing in the attempt to delegitimate Israel, and I think it's really important for us to understand the extent to which that attempt uses many of the same strategies that anti-Semitism has used historically. It's the turning inside out of facts, but picturing them very vividly in ways which are very frightening, but they are very, very similar to things which have been said to discredit Jews in the past. Temple denial is one of the ways of delegitimating Jewish historical grounding in the area of the Middle East. It's not the only way which is used, but it is so basic and so ahistorical. It's shocking but it seems to work with some audiences. Okay, meanwhile, Israelis still feel vulnerable, even though they're so huge and there are so many of them and they're so powerful. They still feel vulnerable, and this is something that sometimes it's hard for people from outside Israel to understand. So I think it's important to bring this up, to mention this. The common image of Israel as the Goliath, where Israel used to be the David. I like an article which I recommend to you by Matti Friedman, journalist Matti Friedman. There is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict to understand why you have to zoom out. What he emphasizes in this article is that many attempts to delegitimate Israel focus on the suffering of people in situations where they are, in fact, suffering as part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they don't pay attention to the historical circumstances that have made this, in Israeli eyes, seem like a necessary situation. And as you see in this quote from him, he urges us to abandon the pleasures of the simple story and to pay attention to the broader context, a complex, multifaceted war or set of linked wars devastating this part of the world from Libya through Syria and Iraq to Yemen. I want to open this up and ask you the journalistic anti-Israel tactic of telling a sad story about suffering individuals whom Israel is responsible for. If you were teaching this in the classroom, what strategies could be used to open up a conversation to deal with the fact that people suffer in conflicts, but that suffering doesn't necessarily make the side that they situate themselves on the side which should be supported in order to achieve justice. So let me open that question up now, because I think that for everyone in this room who teaches about these materials, if you have any kind of an interactive situation in your classroom, those questions will come up. So I'm asking, what strategies could one use to deal with that question when it arises? Anyone? Anyone ever teach any of this? Yes, okay. The question is, either because you are teaching the material or you're teaching something else and the question comes up. When people bring evidence which they glean from the popular press or the internet about the suffering of people in the territories, or some kind of suffering of the Palestinian people. And I'm not even talking about situations where there's factual inaccuracies. Let's say that we're talking about a situation where it's factually accurate. How does one deal in a classroom with the subject which has become, I mean, this is one of the ways in which Israel is delegitimated all the time. You show suffering children especially, but suffering anybody. How does one deal in the classroom with, yes?
So I teach a course on modern Israel, and this discussion happens all the time. And even when I don't teach anything about the Middle East, this discussion happens all the time. I don't believe that, I think it's important to talk about both histories as being legitimate. I don't think a lot of times what happens is a lot of the Jewish kids grow up in Jewish day schools, Jewish camps. They don't get the Palestinian narrative. They don't learn about the Al-Nakba. And then they go to college and they're just completely blown away. And then they end up in things like If Not Now, etc., which gives you a very ahistorical understanding of Israel-Palestine. So I talk about the legitimacy of the grievances that the Palestinians are dealing with, but something I also talk about is that I don't say they're not dealing with pain and they have every right to have human rights. I discuss how their own leaders are responsible for a lot of what is going on. One of the big things you always see is Free Gaza, for my students. And I say, okay, Free Gaza from who? There's not a single Jew left in Gaza. So Free Gaza from Hamas, I agree with, so I talk about how it's a lack of leadership on their end. And also, I do discuss that there has been stuff that the Israeli government has done since '48. We can't deny it. I mean, Benny Morris was here. I used his book, so we can't deny it. And that the only way to help both sides is to get to a two-state solution, not a one-state, not from completely getting rid of Israel, because it's not going to happen, but through a two-state solution.
Thank you. Yeah.
Just to follow up on what you've said here, then it seems like the central question is how do the Palestinian masses who are caught in the middle disassociate or disconnect from this Hamas, Hezbollah, these people at the top who really are still bent on destroying Israel and all the things that we've talked about here?
Well, I don't have an answer to that. I don't tell my students I have an answer to that. How am I mean, Hamas has been controlling the Strip since 2006. And as Charles said the other day, there have been more Israeli elections in this 1 year than in the Palestinian territory. So I don't have an answer to that. But what I do have an answer to is the idea that the only grievances that have happened to the Palestinians is due to Israel. I acknowledge that Israel plays a role in that and has, but you can't just put it all on Israel when Israel doesn't even control the territory, the Strip anymore. So I don't have an answer to that, and it's heartbreaking.
Sure.
When I teach the class, I don't teach from a one perspective. Both narratives are valid, and I always say this. Someone like Rashida Tlaib, I understand that her grandmother and her mother went through that pain, and I always tell my students, and I would like for her to understand that Israelis and Jews also go through that pain, and acknowledging both narratives. Yossi Klein Halevi is a big, it's a book that I use with my students because it's saying I acknowledge your pain, I acknowledge mine, so we could start having a dialogue. And the biggest problem is a lot of these students who ask this question believe in anti-normalization. They don't want to have dialogue. If you believe that Israel has a right to exist, then I as a professor and my students who believe in Israel having a right to exist have no place at your table. And how do we get to anything when there's a belief amongst a majority of the students of anti-normalization?
Thanks. Yes.
So I have a deeper question and concern, and that's the division between advocacy in the classroom and scholarship, especially around these narratives. And at what point do we cease to be third-person dispassionate critical thinking scholars, welcoming everybody into our classroom, and then become Zionist or Israel advocates in some way? And that line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is tricky.
Yeah.
I'll give a concrete example. I had in my course on anti-Semitism a Palestinian Muslim woman, undergraduate, who came to me through the history department in sort of a personal thing, because I don't get Palestinian Muslims in the class. And in the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism moment, one of the students who didn't do the reading asked what Zionism was. Before I could tell him to do the reading, the Palestinian student burst out, "It's killing children." And when she said that, she was not saying it, in my mind, from a political advocacy. She was in deep personal anguish and pain. I handled that moment, and it kind of shut down the class when she did that, and I handled that moment by publicly acknowledging her and appreciating her for the fact that she was there, for the fact that she said that, and I thought the purpose of a university is a place where Palestinian Muslim women can be in a course to learn about anti-Zionism and be human. So that was sort of my case between advocacy and scholarship.
So it sounds like you handled an extremely painful moment very deftly. So congratulations to you for that. But I think that what we're dealing with here is a situation which is very, very painful. There's a lot of pain on both sides, which is why I brought up the issue. But I think that when we teach, we always need to have clear in our minds that, as you do, the historical timeline, what happened when, why it happened. So there is no conflict in human history where there wasn't misery on both sides. And that's what we really, really need to keep in our minds. That, like when you talk about Jewish exceptionalism, Jews aren't lifted out of human history. Jews, when they are in a conflict where they are actors, as opposed to just being acted upon, come up with the same moral conflicts as everybody else has to experience. If you go even to what you might think of as the most righteous conflict in human history, the Second World War, getting rid of Hitler, there was misery on both sides. What Hitler did is historically documented. But there was plenty of stuff that happened on both sides, which was maybe not the most moral way to handle things, or certainly not the kindest way to handle things, because that's what happens when you are in a conflict situation. I'm not saying this to excuse anything. I'm just saying that we need to look at Jews in the context of human beings and human history. If we're saying that Jews are human beings, then we are also saying that they are subject to the same fallibilities as other human beings. They should try to do the best they can, the same as anyone should try to do the best they can. I always like to look to Bret Stephens. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a columnist. Despite his name and despite the way he looks, he actually is Jewish. And he writes, what?
Can I comment on the previous comment before you go on to something else?
Well, let me just read what I want to read. Can you remember what you're going to say? Okay, thank you. And here is what the way Bret Stephens talks about this whole situation that Israel is in which anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish power are utilized consistently. And we need to recognize these. Like, in addition to being empathetic, we also need to recognize the extent to which people who hate the Jews are using anti-Semitic tropes to delegitimate Israel and the Jews, and that is part of the dynamic of what is going on. And here is Bret Stephens. Anti-Zionism, that is rejection not just of this or that Israeli policy, but also the idea of a Jewish state itself, is becoming a respectable position among people who would never support the elimination of any other country in any other circumstance. And it is churning up a new wave of nakedly anti-Jewish bigotry in its wake. Equally disturbing is the progressive assertion Israel and its supporters did this to themselves. More than half a century of occupation of Palestinian territories is a massive injustice, and endless occupation makes Israel's vaunted democracy less about Jewish self-determination than it is about ethnic subjugation. So that's the narrative about Israel, which is out there, which Bret Stephens points out. And another commentator, Laurie Zolot, a professor, says that the typical anti-Israel rhetoric is to speak of Israel on campus is to speak of a colonialist, fascist, ethnic cleansing machine, the equivalent of defending apartheid in South Africa. So I think we need to recognize that that rhetoric is out there. In addition to the human suffering on both sides. There is a very, very powerful machine that undermines a balanced appreciation of the facts on both sides. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, no, I just, I wanted to comment and offer some potential alternative thoughts to the comment about what to do if a young Palestinian woman in the class who would shout out Zionism is killing babies. And the question I would ask is, would we tolerate someone in a class insisting that the earth is flat, or that creationism is the only possible explanation? I think we would not. In other words, I think clearly anti-factual statements in a university need to be challenged. The difference here is clearly that this woman is bringing a huge amount of emotional baggage. And by that I don't mean to diminish the authenticity of the emotional feeling that she's bringing in with that. But I also don't think that we as scholars should be hostage to emotions, or even or hostage to this kind of emotional argument. I think that we have to challenge the student to recognize that, number one, what she says may not be factual, and number two, that what she says is very easily understood to be itself the kind of racist comment that is the source of her traumatization because of prior racist comments about Arabs and Muslims. So to say Zionism is baby killing is racism. It's a racist comment. It is a racist comment. It is a blood libel. It is a blood libel comment. And I think it needs to be challenged. And it's very, very difficult on the campuses. I refer you all to Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Coddling of the American Mind. It is very difficult on the contemporary campus because students have been taught that, number one, it's really wonderful to be a victim, and number two, that emotions are far more important than thoughts, ideas, and arguments. And so we actually live in a really distorted academy right now.
So, yeah, but yeah.
I'll just say, I don't want to engage it here because this
Yeah.
is your time. I'll say that
I couldn't hear you.
I said I don't want to engage this now because I don't want to take the professor's time. I want to say that I have concerns with many of the things in the depictions in terms of those conclusions based upon what I experienced in that room. And during break time, coffee, tea, I'd love to engage anyone who would like to talk about the complexities of that moment.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay. So even if everything were 100% black and white, even if there were no murkiness, and there's plenty of murkiness, but even if there were no murkiness, when you have a student in the classroom who, there's two possibilities, maybe three. One is that the student is in pain, and really it came from her heart. The second possibility is she wasn't in pain. She is trying to project a certain narrative. She wants to make a rhetorical point. She's learned that the best way to make a rhetorical point is to talk about dead babies, okay? There's also a third possibility, which is both, okay? That she is in pain, and also she sees an opening to make a point. And you don't actually, unless you know the student very well, you don't know which. So somebody who's in the classroom, who's the adult in charge, has to figure out how to deal with all of the above. So my way of thinking, an expression of sympathy is always useful, even for tactical reasons. Why? Just hold on. I'm up here. Even for tactical reasons, because there's no point in alienating half the class, okay? An expression of sympathy to show you're a human being, you understand. Assume she's in pain. Act as though you care as if she's in pain, just from a tactical standpoint. That's a useful strategy. And it might even be the way you feel. But then you have a responsibility, I believe, as a professor. You're the authority up there. You have a responsibility because we want people to pay attention to the facts, to reality. That is why we are professors. We're supposed to profess. So we're the ones who are supposed to be the carriers of factual information. Once you've handled it, however it's comfortable for you to handle it and be sympathetic, supportive, but make sure that the students don't leave that classroom thinking that a non-fact is a fact. And here actually are where I find, here actually is...
Zionism is killing babies, it's a known fact.
But and what about the thing it causes someone who's a Jew and having a blood libel being thrown in their face and claiming that they're killing babies for being Zionists? Our offense doesn't count?
Okay. So what I'm saying is this, that you as the professor, whatever you think the facts are, when you're up there, you are the carrier of authority. So it's your job before you get up there to actually make sure you know what the facts are exactly. And then it's your responsibility to help the students access the facts. You are never actually going to be able to control what every student in the class thinks. If you don't know that yet, you will know it. But what you have the responsibility to do is to try to get them to see what you believe the facts to be. And that's one of the reasons not to alienate them, even if you disagree 100% with what they are saying. Regardless of where you come down here, there are going to be some students who you don't agree with and some students who you do agree with. But your best chance at getting your version, your understanding of what has happened across is by not being overtly hostile to any of the students in the class, even if you don't happen to agree with them, regardless of where you situate yourself. Now, from where I stand, I like using occasionally not just historical or sociological materials, but also literature and also columnists like Bret Stephens, who, as you see up here, Bret Stephens, to my mind, clarifies the actual history, and I'm going to read this. Israel's enemies were committed to its destruction before it occupied a single inch of Gaza or the West Bank. In proportion to its size, Israel has voluntarily relinquished more territory it taken in war than any state in the world. And you can look this up to see if it's true. Israeli prime ministers offered a Palestinian state in 2000 and 2008. They were refused both times. The government of Ariel Sharon removed every Israeli settlement and soldier from the Gaza Strip in 2005. The result of Israel's withdrawal allowed Hamas to seize power 2 years later and spark 3 wars. Nearly 1,300 Israeli civilians have been killed in Palestinian terrorist attacks. He's not talking about war, he's talking about civilian terrorist attacks in this century. That's the proportional equivalent of about 16 September 11ths in the United States. So that would be something that I would want, but I understand that not everyone sitting in this room, that might not be your choice. But the responsibility, I think, of the person running the class is to engage people and then to make sure that when they walk out of the room at the end of that day, that you have communicated what you believe the accurate without, if at all possible, without putting down embarrassing, humiliating people in the class, although I can understand that very, 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 very rarely that might be the only option. Yeah.
So I do not teach this anti-Semitism, I teach about racism to primarily classes of white students. And often I'll have a similar experience where a white student will get teary and say, oh, but we now are blamed for everything, and this privilege makes me feel so uncomfortable, and then she'll start waving in front of her face and cry. And what I do is I comfort her and ask her friends if she needs a hug or tissues, what would make her feel good. And then once she feels safe and okay, I ask her to tell me more about that, usually about 5 times. And that way I'm able to understand where or what she's willing to share. That's what I can understand. What is she willing to share? And I try to record it if it will bring information to the class. And then by saying, tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. I can see where she's coming from and then correct misinformation that she might have or a perspective that's just not supported by reality.
Which she's ready to listen to because you've already been sympathetic. So that's strategically, that's a good reason to use sympathy as a strategy if you've got the right class size. It's hard to do when you have a class of 80 or 100 or 120 people. Yeah.
I definitely agree on the primary importance of sympathy and compassion. But as a person who grew up actually believing that Zionism is killing children, I do coddling somebody's emotion in that instance is not doing anyone any favor. I am not doubting the authenticity of the almost traumatic grievance. But those traumatic grievances, especially in that culture I came from, can be entirely based on fictitious and imaginary reasons.
Yeah.
And I'll give an example of the cartoons, of the famous Danish cartoons. You had almost a billion people on the planet sad and angry and grieving and demonstrating based on a complete imaginary crime. So in that case, coddling those grievances is not doing anyone any favor. Especially at this university, when the domain of emotion and the domains of fact should be completely separate. So I believe that, yeah, sympathy and compassion is important, but factual errors need to be challenged if you truly want to help that person.
Yeah. So I agree with you. I think that to be an effective teacher, it is helpful to be able to express sympathy when you can, and sometimes even when you don't want to, at least to not alienate. You may have no choice, but you're alienating a person who's on an extreme, extreme position. But what you don't want to do is alienate the rest of the class. So therefore, I would recommend as a strategy finding ways to articulate an expression of sympathy while at the same time correcting factual misimpressions. I think it's really important because you are the authority figure, and you have students who, if you as an authority figure are picking on one of them, they can feel very sympathetic to the one of them that's getting picked on, and you can lose your chance to influence the way they understand things. So it's a teaching strategy. Yeah.
I am the label on myself, white Jewish female. I've been teaching at a historic Design college for 20 years. So I have navigated students conspiracy statements and assumptions about Jews, and I will explore that with them. But when a student, and we are talking mostly about 18 to 22-year-olds,
Right.
so as the adults in the room, I think we do, and I've worked with adolescents my whole entire professional life, we must be sensitive to these developmental issues because it is the reality of the students. So I was also trained in short-term counseling in my first career, crisis counseling. So anytime you're dealing with human beings, especially in the setting of a classroom where we are in charge of the safety of that space for all students, you need to acknowledge pain. I hear you're very upset. That's all you have to do. You don't have to agree or disagree. I see you're in pain. I see this is very difficult for you. This is causing you strife or struggle or whatever. And I would do what my colleague here said, that you just give that student a minute to return to a better space, and the students around him or her who are probably also either empathizing, like, wow, she's really upset, what's this professor going to do about this? But in my classroom, those issues are more about race. I am a minority as a racialized American label in my classroom, and I have had debates between Black students about the impact of the socioeconomic differences, about welfare, so many things. And I have not had this type of thing. I don't have any Palestinian students, and it hasn't come up yet in my classes, but it will this coming year. And I think that's the first defense, because our job is, yes, it's facts, and if you're teaching undergraduate courses in particular, it's safety and respect, because if that gets violated, then no one's going to listen to your facts.
Right.
If your students don't feel safe, everything will shut down.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I was given a signal from the back here. I do want to make sure that we finish with this. When we come back after your coffee break, we are actually going to look at specific anti-Israel organizations. We're going to look at BDS and the use of intersectionality and the misuse of Black Lives Matter, and we're going to look at specific organizations. I want to finish here with this statement here that one of the things that we need to be concerned about is that when students walk out of our classrooms, that they have actually at least heard, I'm not saying they've absorbed, but they have at least heard from your lips, unless you can be really clever and get one of the students to say it, which is even better, but they should have heard from somebody's lips who they're going to believe the actual facts of the situation. So that is one of the hard things about teaching, to balance these, especially when you're dealing with people who look big but actually aren't really, we know now, developmentally mature quite yet. But it's your responsibility to make sure that they leave that classroom with your version of the facts. Even if my version and your version don't agree, whatever you think the facts are, and you're being real responsible in terms of preparing in a way that you have the actual sociological, historical facts, it's your responsibility that they leave with some articulation of that and something to look it up so that they know that it's true. And yet you have to also not alienate them as much as you can. And I'm going to refer in closing now to something somebody said yesterday, which I thought was, I heard a lot of really smart things yesterday, but one of the smart things I heard was that remember that you don't want to lose the middle of your class. You're going to have things which are articulated, which you may feel, as this gentleman said, is like it's propaganda. It's off the wall. It's being said deliberately to spread lies. But even if you feel that, you don't want to alienate the rest of your class. And if you pick on a student overtly, I mean, just from a strategic standpoint, you're going to alienate the rest of your class. You're going to lose the people you want to influence. So that's one of the things that makes teaching so challenging. You've got to know where you want to end up. You've got to have some leeway so that they get to talk and you get there. But you want to make sure that they walk out of that classroom at least knowing what the teacher thinks. Then they could disagree with you, but they should at least know what the teacher thinks when they walk out of that classroom. And right now, the teacher thinks we should all go get coffee.